Smoke curled into the twilight sky above the ruins of Karak 4, a once thriving city now reduced to broken stone and smoldering wreckage. The heavy thud of Terran boots against cracked pavement echoed in the silence that followed the battle. Sergeant Vale moved steadily, her armor a battered shell, blackened by plasma blasts and streaked with crimson dust. Around her, the rest of the 12th Terran Infantry trudged forward, scanning the wreckage not for enemies, but for survivors. The war had left no building untouched. Every home was a collapsed memory, every street a graveyard of twisted metal. Children peeked out from behind crumbled walls, their alien faces smudged with soot and wide with fear. Some clutched ragged toys, others simply held on to each other, eyes locked onto the advancing humans. Vale caught the movement from the corner of her eye and slowed her pace, raising a hand to signal the others. The squad behind her stopped without a sound, weapons held low. No one wanted to spook the civilians more than they already were. With a hiss, she unlatched her helmet and pulled it free, revealing tangled hair matted with sweat and dirt. She offered a tired smile toward the children, kneeling down slowly to make herself smaller, less threatening. A young Karakian girl, her scales dulled with dust, stared at Vale. Her tiny hands clutched a broken datapad to her chest. Vale reached into a pouch on her belt, pulling out a ration bar. She unwrapped it carefully and placed it on the ground in front of her, sliding it forward. The girl hesitated, then darted out, snatched the bar, and scurried back behind the wall. Moments later, a woman, probably her mother, emerged cautiously, speaking in the halting, accented standard language. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her scaled cheeks. Vale gave a small nod and stood, motioning for the medics to move in. Further down the street, Corporal Reyes lifted a slab of fallen concrete with a grunt, revealing a Karakian boy trapped underneath. His breathing was shallow, his leg twisted unnaturally. Reyes tapped his comm. "Need a stretcher here now." Private Luma, her armor stained with soot, sprinted over, dragging a collapsible stretcher. They worked quickly, wrapping the boy in a thermal blanket before carrying him back toward the field hospital they'd set up just outside the blast zone. None of the Terrans spoke much. The weight of the battle still hung thick in the air, and every life they pulled from the rubble was a small victory carved from a sea of loss. As Vale made her way deeper into the ruins, she passed walls pockmarked by railgun fire and scorch marks where grenades had detonated. She paused by a particularly gruesome sight, a collapsed building where the enemy had holed up using civilians as shields. It hadn't saved them. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the bitter scent of charred flesh, and let the guilt settle deep in her chest. War was never clean, no matter how many medals they pinned to your chest afterward. A movement to her right snapped her out of it. She turned to see a group of alien elders, their robes torn and dust-covered, struggling to lift a heavy beam pinning one of their own. Vale jogged over, waved the others back, and set her shoulder under the beam. With a low growl, she heaved, muscles burning under the weight of the armor and the strain. It shifted just enough for the elders to drag their companion free. They bowed low to her in gratitude, speaking quickly in their native tongue. She didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. She gave them a brief nod, wiping dust from her face, smearing it across her cheeks. By the time night fell, the Terrans had pulled over 200 civilians from the rubble. The makeshift triage center was overflowing, the air thick with antiseptic and the low murmur of the wounded. Vale sat on a crate outside, methodically cleaning her weapon with slow, automatic movements. Her armor was barely holding together, the left pauldron had a long gash across it, and her breastplate was scorched black. She caught her reflection in a broken window, her face gaunt, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She looked more like a ghost than a savior. A soft tug on her glove made her look down. The Karakian girl from earlier stood there, clutching the empty wrapper of the ration bar. She looked up at Vale with wide, solemn eyes and then leaned forward, placing a small, wilted flower in Vale's lap. No words were spoken. None were needed. Vale's throat tightened, and she gave the girl a shaky smile, ruffling the child's dust-caked hair gently. Around her, the city remained broken, scarred by the clash of armies and ideologies. But in this small moment, beneath the shattered stars of Karak 4, something fragile and precious had survived. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the eastern quarter as the Terran forces moved out, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the smoke and dust. Sergeant Vale led the charge through the devastated industrial sector, her team fanned out in a search pattern. Intelligence reports said a pocket of resistance still remained, and even now, they were wary. The enemy had a habit of laying traps, and the Kuruk 4 campaign had taught them harsh lessons about overconfidence. Vale's boots crunched over broken glass as she stepped into what was once a manufacturing plant. Machines lay silent, tangled in collapsed steel beams. Her visor flickered with movement indicators, and she raised a fist, halting the squad. The sharp, mechanical clicks of safeties being flicked off sounded around her as the soldiers tightened their formation. A shape moved in the smoke, small, hunched. Vale squinted, her rifle raised but finger off the trigger. The shape stumbled forward into the light, an elderly Karakian, his robes torn and stained. He held up empty hands, palms open, his body trembling. Private Daz moved forward cautiously, weapon trained low. "Clear," he called out, glancing back at Vale. She nodded and pressed forward. As they closed the distance, the old Karakian dropped to his knees, pleading in a rasping voice none of them could fully understand. Vale knelt down, her exosuit whirring softly. She tapped into her translation module, a cracked and unreliable piece of tech, but enough to pick out words. "Trap, run," the elder gasped. Vale's eyes widened. She threw her arm up in a silent signal just as the ground beneath them exploded. Shrapnel filled the air, the blast sending her skidding across the cracked concrete. Pain screamed up her side where her armor took the brunt of the explosion. Ears ringing, she rolled onto her stomach and pulled her rifle up. The smoke parted to reveal a squad of enemy soldiers, sleek in dark armor, emerging from hidden alcoves. They opened fire, brilliant bursts of energy lighting up the gloom. Vale scrambled to cover behind a twisted girder, returning fire with sharp, measured bursts. Around her, the Terrans adapted instantly, laying down suppressive fire and dragging wounded comrades into safety. Reyes cursed loudly over the comms as he unloaded a full magazine toward the advancing enemy. "Ambush, repeat, we've got a goddamn ambush," he barked. Vale peeked out and spotted a heavy gun emplacement being dragged into place further down the ruined hall. If they didn't take it out fast, the squad would be pinned. Gripping a grenade, she lobbed it overhand, the device arcing perfectly before detonating in a flash of white-hot destruction. The emplacement was shredded, but more enemies poured in, relentless. Daz moved to flank but was caught by a sniper round that punched through his shoulder plate. He dropped with a grunt, struggling to crawl back to cover. Vale swore under her breath and pushed forward, rallying her team with clipped, brutal orders. The firefight was a blur of motion, ducking, firing, reloading, moving. She could feel the pulse of adrenaline in her veins, the familiar edge of rage sharpening her senses. She hated the enemy more in that moment than she ever thought possible, hated how they hid behind civilians, how they desecrated the ruins of a once proud city. She ducked under a fallen beam, squeezed the trigger, and dropped 2 hostiles with quick, precise shots. Reinforcements arrived, heavy footsteps pounding as armored Terran Marines joined the fray, hurling concussion grenades that tore through the enemy ranks. The tide turned swiftly. With brutal efficiency, the Terrans drove the ambushers back, leaving only scorched earth and smoking bodies behind. The silence that followed was deafening. Vale stood amidst the wreckage, chest heaving, smoke curling from the barrel of her rifle. She scanned the area, her mind still racing, heart thudding painfully in her ears. The old Karakian was still alive, miraculously unharmed by the blast. He huddled behind a broken machine, watching the Terrans with wide, fearful eyes. Vale approached him slowly, removing her helmet so he could see her face. She knelt again, offering him a hand. He flinched but did not pull away. "Safe now," she said, the translator crackling over her words. He hesitated, then took her hand, his clawed fingers trembling against her armored glove. Behind her, the medics worked quickly, patching up Daz and checking the rest of the squad for injuries. Reyes stood over the bodies of the enemy soldiers, his face grim. "They weren't just holding out," he said bitterly. "They wanted to make a statement." Vale nodded grimly. Every move the enemy made was designed to terrorize, to break them down mentally as well as physically. But they hadn't broken yet. Not here. Not ever. As the squad regrouped, Vale caught a glimpse of herself reflected in a twisted metal panel. Blood splattered across her battered armor, dirt streaking her skin. She looked every inch the monster their enemies claimed humans to be, and yet here she was, pulling civilians from the fire, standing between innocence and annihilation. Not all heroes wore clean armor. Some wore the blood and ashes of a war they didn't start but intended to finish. Night fell like a heavy shroud over the battlefield, the burning ruins casting long, twitching shadows across the landscape. Sergeant Vale moved carefully through the broken city, her squad behind her, weapons raised and eyes sharp. They were deep in enemy territory now, pushing further into sectors the main force hadn't secured yet. Every step forward felt like dragging the weight of 1,000 dead dreams with them. Above, unmanned Terran drones buzzed, scanning for hostiles, but the enemy had adapted, learned to move like ghosts. Suddenly, a flicker of movement drew Vale's attention. She raised a hand, signaling a halt. Her visor zoomed in, focusing through the gloom. A group of figures moved near a collapsed library, shapes too small and unarmed to be soldiers. Refugees. Civilians. She exhaled slowly, lowering her weapon and stepping forward cautiously, her armor creaking softly. "Identify yourselves," she called out, her voice amplified just enough to be firm but not threatening. A young Karakian woman stepped forward, clutching a child to her chest, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Behind her, others emerged, old men, wounded, families clutching makeshift bundles. Vale's chest tightened at the sight. They weren't fighters, just survivors trying to escape the hellscape their world had become. As she moved to signal the squad to lower their weapons, a sharp crack split the air. A sniper round whistled past, slamming into a wall behind them, showering them with sparks and debris. Instantly, the civilians dropped to the ground, screaming. Vale snapped her rifle up, scanning the rooftops. "Contact! Sniper!" she barked into the comms. Reyes and Daz returned fire instinctively, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the ruined streets. Vale sprinted forward, sliding behind a chunk of fallen masonry, her mind already running tactical calculations. The sniper wasn't aiming for the soldiers, he was targeting the civilians. Psychological warfare. Another shot rang out, this time hitting a young Karakian male in the leg. He howled in agony, clutching his bleeding limb. Vale cursed under her breath and keyed her comms. "Suppressing fire on my mark. Reyes, Daz, pin him down. I'm going to move these people." Without waiting for a reply, she bolted from cover, sprinting low across the open ground. Bullets and plasma scorched the air around her, but she moved with the lethal grace of hard-earned experience. She reached the injured civilian, hoisting him up with one arm and half carrying, half dragging him back toward the others. The rest of the squad laid down a wall of suppressive fire, forcing the sniper to retreat deeper into the ruins. As soon as the immediate threat abated, Vale turned her attention to the civilians. She knelt by the young man, assessing his injury with a glance. The wound was bad but survivable. She patched it quickly, working by feel and training more than sight. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice clipped. "Too exposed." She waved to Reyes, who came forward, providing cover as they organized the civilians into a mobile group. They moved fast, ducking and weaving through alleys, staying low, Vale constantly scanning for new threats. As they rounded a crumbled building, the ground suddenly shook with a low rumble. A Karakian troop transport, repurposed by the enemy and bristling with guns, rolled into view. Vale swore, dragging the nearest civilian into cover. "Back, back!" she shouted. The transport's guns spun up with a mechanical whine, and seconds later, heavy rounds chewed into the rubble around them. Reyes hurled a smoke grenade into the street, the dense cloud blooming instantly. Under its cover, they pulled back, desperate to find a defensible position. The civilians stumbled, some crying, others too shocked to react. Vale pushed them onward, a steady hand in the chaos. They ducked into the remains of a bank building, the walls thick enough to provide real shelter. The squad set up defensive positions, and Vale exhaled in relief as the civilians huddled behind the broken counters and furniture. Over the comms, the rest of the Terran forces were alerted to their situation. Reinforcements were coming, but it would take time. They had to hold. Vale checked her rifle, swapping out the magazine with quick, practiced movements. She glanced at Reyes, who gave her a grim nod. "We make our stand here," he said simply. The enemy transport rumbled closer, its spotlight cutting through the smoke. Vale took a deep breath, feeling the familiar cold calm settle over her. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and burdened with civilians, but surrender wasn't in a Terran soldier's vocabulary. Not here. Not ever. The first wave of enemy troops appeared through the smoke, dark silhouettes moving with purpose. Vale didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger, the rifle bucking against her shoulder. The first enemy dropped, then another. Reyes and Daz opened up with disciplined bursts, forcing the attackers to ground. Civilians screamed and ducked, but none ran. They trusted the Terrans now, Vale realized distantly, trusted these dirty, battered soldiers to protect them against the darkness. The fighting intensified, the night split by gunfire and shouted orders. Vale fought with a ferocity born of desperation and something more, a stubborn, unyielding will to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The enemy tried to flank them, but Daz spotted the move and cut them down with a grenade tossed perfectly into their midst. The transport's guns pounded the front of the building, shaking the walls, but the bank held. For now. Vale moved constantly, checking on her squad, encouraging the civilians, directing fire. She was everywhere at once, a force of nature, unstoppable. When the enemy finally fell back, leaving their dead and wounded in the street, Vale stood in the ruins, smoke curling around her like a cloak. She was exhausted, bleeding from a cut above her brow, but she was standing. And so were the civilians. They had survived the night because the Terrans didn't run. Because heroes didn't wear clean armor. They wore scars and blood and dirt, and they wore it with pride. Morning broke over the city like a bruised eye, the sun struggling to pierce the thick smoke that still clung to the ruins. Vale stood atop a collapsed pillar, surveying the aftermath. The civilians were gathered below, battered but alive, while Reyes and Daz made quick work of fortifying their temporary shelter. Reinforcements hadn't arrived yet, and the radio crackled with intermittent bursts of static, but no solid contact. They were on their own for now. She could feel the weight of exhaustion in every limb, her armor scuffed and splattered with grime, but she pushed it aside. They needed her clear-headed. A low rumble in the distance made her stiffen. It wasn't the thrum of Terran transports, it was enemy armor, heavier than anything they'd faced so far. Reyes jogged over, his face grim. Scouts say it's a full armored division heading our way. Looks like they want to finish the job. Vale set her jaw. How long until evac? Reyes shook his head. Best estimate. Too long. She descended the rubble pile, her mind already moving through the options. None of them were good. Stand and fight, and they'd be crushed under tank treads. Run, and the civilians would be slaughtered. They didn't have enough firepower to take on armor directly. Not conventionally. But Vale wasn't trained to think conventionally. She glanced at the destroyed Karakian buildings, noting the narrow alleyways, the unstable ruins, the exposed fuel lines that snaked through the old industrial sectors. Terrain could be a weapon. She keyed her comms. Reyes, Daz, we're not holding the bank. We're setting a trap. Within minutes, they were moving. The civilians were hurried through back routes, Vale mapping the quickest evacuation paths in her mind while marking the deadliest kill zones. The squad split up, planting explosives in strategic locations, hidden under rubble piles, inside abandoned vehicles, tucked into the walls of ruined buildings. By the time the first enemy scouts rolled into view, the trap was set. Vale crouched behind a broken archway, watching the lead tank grind over the cracked pavement. It was an ugly machine, all rusted plates and cruel spikes, flying the enemy's blood-red banners. Behind it came infantry transports, their hatches bristling with troops. Over the comms, Reyes gave a low whistle. Target-rich environment. Vale smiled grimly. Hold until they're in the box. The seconds stretched out like hours as the enemy advanced, unaware of the danger. Then, when the lead tank crossed the threshold into the kill zone, Vale clicked the detonator. The explosion was a thunderous roar that shook the earth. The tank lifted into the air in a ball of fire, landing on its side with a shriek of torn metal. Debris rained down, and the enemy column slammed to a halt in confusion. Before they could regroup, Reyes and Daz opened up from concealed positions, their shots precise and deadly. Vale moved like a phantom through the smoke, taking down stragglers, her rifle an extension of her will. The civilians, hidden deeper in the ruins, huddled together, silent, trusting. The battle raged. The enemy poured fire into the ruins, trying to suppress the unseen Terran soldiers, but Vale had chosen her ground well. Every shot they fired revealed their positions, and every time they moved, they triggered more traps. Explosive charges buried under the streets tore through enemy lines. Walls collapsed onto squads attempting to flank. In the chaos, Vale slipped through, leading deadly hit-and-run strikes that kept the enemy disoriented. But it wasn't enough. For every tank they disabled, 2 more rumbled forward. For every squad they broke, another replaced it. Vale ducked behind cover, catching her breath, blood pounding in her ears. Rhea's voice came over the comms, strained. "We're getting overrun." Vale looked toward the civilians. She couldn't let it end here. Not like this. She made the decision without hesitation. "Fall back to Point Kappa. I'll draw them off." Reyes started to argue, but she cut him off. "That's an order." She sprinted into the open, firing into the advancing enemy ranks, shouting, taunting them. The enemy responded predictably, diverting tanks and troops toward her. She led them away, deeper into the unstable ruins, where more explosives waited. The detonations rocked the ground behind her as she ran, weaving through crumbling alleyways, drawing more of the enemy with every step. Finally, she found herself cornered in a shattered plaza, surrounded. She dropped to one knee, reloading her last magazine. The enemy commander stepped forward, a hulking figure in black armor, sneering through his rebreather mask. "You should have surrendered, Terran," he growled. Vale laughed, the sound raw and defiant. "You first." She triggered the final set of charges, hidden in the foundations of the surrounding buildings. The entire plaza caved in with a deafening roar, swallowing her and the enemy in a vortex of dust and fire. Far away, Reyes and Daz led the civilians through a hidden tunnel, emerging onto a Terran evacuation zone just as dropships roared in overhead. The survivors looked back toward the burning city, where the battle still raged. Reyes clenched his fists, grief and pride warring in his chest. Vale had bought their lives with her own. As the dropships lifted into the sky, carrying them to safety, Reyes whispered a promise to the smoke-choked horizon. "We'll tell them, Vale. We'll tell them what you did. Not all heroes wear clean armor. Some wear the scars of every soul they saved."